So in this video, we're going to move on to the subject of macroevolution. Macro meaning changes on a large scale, micro, small, macro, large. And, I have to have my standard apoptosis picture in here and not really know why I have it. There's a lot of things we've talked about before. So let's look at this concept of speciation. Speciation means the evolution or the creation of or the change into a new species. And there are basically two pathways when it comes to speciation. They are called anagenesis or cladogenesis or cladogenesis. Ana means without. And so basically, this idea of anagenesis is where there's no break in the pathway of evolution. You can just think of this as an accumulation of small changes over time that if you look, you see a different change. This is kind of like, and this is not a very good illustration because we're not talking about years like millions of years. We're talking about just 20. But if you look at a person over the course of 15 or 20 years, they change a lot. But if you know that person, you see them every day, those changes accumulate so slowly that you don't really perceive them as well as you might if you didn't see them very often. Think about that with my own children. It's just very imperceptible. And so this kind of thing may be like close to anagenesis, where cladogenesis is going to be there's going to be a break at some point. And in that break, you're going to have several different groups form. And typically with cladogenesis, you have these points of breaking. And at that point, we would say that that point represents a common ancestor between those two groups that broke off. And at some point in their history, they broke off, but that one point represents that common ancestor between both. And so this can be as small as a couple of different types of birds, or this can be as big as, amphibians going one direction, reptiles going the other, so to speak. And so, with that, when we talk about the creation of new species, we need to define the word species. We've done this already in this, and we talked about when I briefly mentioned when we define species that there's other ways to define the word species. And the way that we defined it initially was these groups are a group of organisms that can mate to create fertile offspring. And that is the key, that their mating produces a product that is fertile offspring, not just any offspring, but fertile. Now, there are certain barriers that can exist that cause species to go one direction or another so that they're no longer able to successfully mate together to create that fertile offspring. So we're going to look at some of those barriers. This is a nice catch-all picture for this. It's very helpful. There are two groups of these barriers. There are pre-zygotic barriers and post-zygotic barriers. So just think about the words zygotic. I mean zygote, right? We know how zygotes are formed. That's the process of fertilization. Sperm plus egg equals zygote. And so there are certain barriers that are going to be pre-zygote, or where fertilization is just not going to happen. All right. Then there's other barriers where the zygote is formed, fertilization did occur. However, there's something else that is keeping viable offspring from being formed. And so let's look at these. So let's under the, I'm just going to go from left to right on those pre-zygotic barriers. You have habitat isolation. This is simple. What's keeping them from doing it? They live in two different environments. The one type of frog lives in the trees, the other type of frog lives on the ground. They're just not seeing each other. And so they don't mate together, and that's how that happens. And so that's habitat isolation. Temporal isolation is time. Temporal means time. And so this could be that they reproduce at different times of year. You can think of, well, Right now, as it gets warmer, you can hear frogs outside calling, but not every frog is calling. Only one or two species of frog are calling right now. As the year progresses and as it gets warmer and as we move into summer, those frogs that are calling now are going to stop, and another species of frog is going to start calling. They reproduce at different times, or it could be times of day. So you have some species that are nocturnal and some that are diurnal, meaning that they're active during the day. There's behavioral isolation. So this is like we talked about in the last video with the sexual dimorphism and interspecific competition, where you have the male that is trying to attract a female. Well, some birds, like a chicken, is not going to be impressed by the male peacock, and so they are behaviorally isolated, meaning that behavior, the male peacock strutting its stuff and showing its feathers, the everyday chicken is like, okay, that's just not impressive to them. So they're behaviorally isolated. They're just not going to mate. Now, there are things that happen after the mating attempt, in that the mating attempt has occurred, but there are other isolations that are keeping fertilization from occurring. This is mechanical isolation. Mechanical isolation is basically the reproductive parts don't fit together. So the fact that mating attempt has occurred is one thing, but the parts don't match, and so fertilization can't occur. Gametic isolation is where maybe the parts match, but the sperm and egg don't recognize one another. Remember, we talked about fertilization, how there's a chemical match between that sperm and that egg, that there's a chemical reaction that takes place between those two cells. Gametic isolation is where that reaction just can't take place. So let's say that all of that works. Fertilization does occur. Sperm plus egg equals zygote does happen. Then there are some things that still keep that species from forming, or keep those two individuals from making fertile offspring. There's reduced hybrid viability, meaning where the hybrid just can't survive very long. It dies during development. Maybe it dies in the womb, and it just kind of like a miscarriage. There's reduced hybrid fertility, where the hybrid survives, but it just can't reproduce. This is like a mule. A horse and a donkey mate together, fertilization occurs, offspring is born, it's a mule, but mules can't reproduce because they're not fertile. And so that keeps horses and donkeys separate from one another. They don't blend into one species. And then the last one is hybrid breakdown. This is where the hybrid lives. It may even be able to reproduce, but after a few generations, that ability to reproduce is going to go away. And so it's not viable. And so if all of those barriers are gone, then there is the ability for that species to stay intact. But if those barriers begin to come up, those groups are going to isolate themselves from one another. And this is where you're going to have speciation occur. So that's the biological species concept. There are other ways to think about species. Ecological species concept is this big idea, and this has to do with talking about species as referring to their niche. So we have talked about these niches in very big roles, like producers, consumers, and then even different levels of consumers, decomposers, and so forth. We've talked about this in a former video. And so these are going to be really general terms, and even you can get more specific and you talk about things like apex predators or keystone species. A keystone species is a species that is kind of like the key for the whole ecosystem. If you take it out, the whole ecosystem falls apart. You get the idea. And then lastly, we're going to talk about this idea of the phylogenetic species concept. This has to do with more molecular level. This is growing in popularity as more and more as we learn more and more about genomes and begin to map more and more codes. We learn more about the differences between organisms. And so this has to do with comparing DNA. It has to do with pairing amino acid sequencing. If sequences have a lot in common, those organisms are going to be closely related. If there's very little in common, they're not going to be closely related. And so this can be a way to designate species as well. In the end, there's no right or wrong way to define how a species or what a species is. This just has to do with what is the context. And so in particular context, the phylogenetic concept may be better. In another context, the ecological concept may be better, and the biological concept in another. So you get the idea. Depending on the context, one concept may be good versus another.